Australia's bushfire season has felt nigh on apocalyptic. It started earlier than usual last year. Since June, more than 10 million hectares have been destroyed. At least 30 people have been killed. The country is still burning.
Our house is still on fire. Your inaction is fueling the flames by the hour. And we are telling you to act as if you loved your children above all else.
Earlier, she'd been listening to President Trump.
This is not a time for pessimism. This is a time for optimism. Fear and doubt is not a good thought process, because this is a time for tremendous hope and joy and optimism and action. But to embrace the possibilities of tomorrow, we must reject the perennial prophets of doom and their predictions of the apocalypse.
So what of the new normal in Australia? Has a season of devastating fires changed the whole discussion around climate change?
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
Prime Minister Scott Morrison toppled his predecessor Malcolm Turnbull in 2018. Since then, Turnbull's been a vocal critic of what he terms self-destructive idiocy of climate denialism. Malcolm Turnbull, the former Australian Prime Minister, joins us now. And can I just ask for your thoughts on what Trump called today the perennial prophets of doom and their predictions, the heirs of yesterday's foolish fortune tellers?
Well, Donald Trump's been quite a prophet of doom himself. Cast your mind back to his 2016 acceptance speech at the Republican convention and his the picture he painted of America threatened by crime and gangs and invasion from asylum seekers was quite apocalyptic. So he uses the politics of fear when it suits him, and essentially Trump is the leading climate denier in the world. He's leading the most influential nation in the world and is actively working against global action to reduce emissions. The fundamental problem that we face is that in too many places, the United States in particular and also in Australia, this issue of global warming or global heating has been turned into an ideological issue or a values issue, where in fact it's simply a question of physics. The more greenhouse gases you pump into the atmosphere, the more of the greenhouse effect you get, the warmer the planet gets, and the consequences we are living with. Hotter, drier climate, longer and more droughts, fiercer and more fires. And so here in Australia, we are in the front line of the consequences of climate change, and the question many Australians ask, and the question the world asks, is why is Australia as a nation not also in the front line of taking action to address climate change and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions?
So I guess the response is whatever you do, whatever your Green New Deal looks like, if America and other big countries, big powers aren't on board, ultimately it doesn't matter.
Well, that's just an argument of hopelessness. And you know, try it out yourself. If you go, the tax you pay is a tiny percentage of the total receipts of the inland revenue. Try arguing that you shouldn't have to pay your tax on that basis.
Can I turn it round?
Every nation has...
Can I turn it round and say, would you go a step further? Would you say, at this point, America, with what you're calling the policies or the politics of fear, is not Australia's friend, and you should be looking at that in terms of sanctions? At what point do you say we shouldn't work with countries like that? We shouldn't work with countries that work against our own country's interests. You should take the battle directly to President Trump over his trade deals in the way he would do with China.
Well, I've had a few notable arguments with President Trump, as I'm sure your listeners know. But the fundamental point is that you are seeing countries, and obviously the bigger you are, the more influence you've got. The European Union is saying, particularly via President Macron, is saying we won't enter trade agreements with countries that are not taking action and fulfilling their Paris Climate Treaty obligations. There is a very strong argument in the United States, actually, from political conservatives who are not climate change deniers, that there should be an across-the-board carbon tax in the United States, which would then be enforced at the border as well. So if imports came from countries that didn't have a comparable carbon price, the Americans would impose that at the border. But look, as far as Australia is concerned, here is the thing. We are in the front line of climate change, in the consequences. Our country has been on fire, 10 million hectares as you described. You know, dozens of people killed, thousands of properties destroyed, billions of our Australian native fauna killed. It has been a colossal tragedy. But we're in that front line of the consequences. We should be in the front line of action. Yeah. And as an advanced economy, as a wealthy country, as a technologically sophisticated country, we have a duty, both self-interested and moral, to take greater action. And the good news is that we don't have to wear an economic hair shirt to do so.
Let me ask you.
The cheapest new form of generation is renewables.
When you're talking about economic hair shirts and indeed about UK trade, your predecessor, Kevin Rudd, used a notable phrase when he was talking about our post-Brexit trade deals. He said, for the UK to substitute European trade with Commonwealth trade is, his words, utter bollocks. Would you contradict that? Or would you say it's doable for the UK? Or would you say he was on the money?
I'd express it, no, I'd express it differently. But the reality is that, you know, half, as you know very well, half of your trade more or less goes to the European Union. Britain's trade with Australia is a very small percentage, as indeed it is with Canada and other countries in the Commonwealth. So, you know, the reality is that we in Australia wish Britain the very best. We are great friends. When I was PM, when the Brexit vote was carried, I immediately said to David Cameron and then to his successor, Theresa May, we will do a free trade deal with you. We look forward to it, but it's not a substitute for the European Union. I mean, the problem that Britain faces today is simply this. In an age of rising protectionism, the United Kingdom has chosen to walk out of the biggest free trade area in the world, and its economic prospects, its trade prospects now depend on cutting new and better deals with a whole range of countries, not least of which, of course, is the EU itself. Okay. So Malcolm, it's a challenging time for you.
Thank you very much indeed, Malcolm Turnbull.